welcome to my channel on the best of fantasy. From wry grins to outright belly laughs, humor is a big part of the human experience, and of course, it is a big part of why we read. And so, in thinking about the best of fantasy, I thought I would present to you the authors who make me laugh the most, my top 10 fantasy authors who make me laugh, and I would love to hear in the comments about the authors from fantasy and other genres as well who make you laugh. And before I get started, I'd like to note that as I get further down toward number one, it will become increasingly apparent how humor is central to these authors' writing, how it is a part of how they explore the human experience. And it is in fact necessary for the type of journey that they are attempting to allow the reader to go on. So let's begin with my number 10, and that is going to be Jim Butcher, author of the Dresden Files. Now, I want to preface this by saying a lot of people probably would put Butcher much higher on their own personal list. I'm only 6 books into the Dresden Files, and there are aspects of these books that I've absolutely adored in terms of the humor. And some of the humor doesn't land so much for me, and that would be the more voyeuristic moments. So I'm not going to get into that too much, but those don't land for me, which is why probably one of the reasons, I suppose, that Butcher is lower on this list, but still, because there are many moments that really get me. The zany hijinks that Harry Dresden gets into. And I fundamentally do love that character, and his flaws and all. And so Dresden Files has a place in my top 10, and it is possible as I get further into the series that it may even climb on this list. Next, I have as my number 9, none other than JRR Tolkien, author of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion and other things in Middle-earth. And this may be a choice that might surprise some people, but I absolutely love the humor that Tolkien has, not just in The Hobbit, which is, of course, geared toward a slightly younger audience. It's whimsical, and it always makes me laugh when I read it. I love the moments with Bilbo first getting to know the dwarves and how he becomes more and more endearing through his adventures and his discomfort with them and gradual embracing of them. But I also find many moments in Lord of the Rings that give me a big smile. And there's just such warmth in Tolkien's writing that there are many times, not so much in the Silmarillion. I don't think I ever laugh at the Silmarillion. That is just high tragedy right there. But certainly in The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And that is maybe one reason why I think the laughter that Tolkien was so capable of instilling in me in The Hobbit was transferred in some ways. The humanity of it was transferred to the Lord of the Rings. And it's the perfect combination for me of Tolkien's high tragedy in the Silmarillion and whimsical lightheartedness and serious moments as well in The Hobbit. But Lord of the Rings is just the sweet spot for me. But yes, I love Tolkien's sense of humor. It can be very dry sometimes, but it is always endearing for me. And next on my list, I have Robin Hobb, the author of The Realm of the Elderlings, which I have recently finished. Just blew me away in so many ways. But one of the things maybe the most underexplored about Robin Hobb's writing, perhaps, I'm sure many of the fans would agree with me though, is the humor in there. Because there is so much tragedy and heartache and just beauty in the series, it often might be overlooked. But there are some really wonderful humorous moments. A lot of them are between Night Eyes and Fitz, of course. And Night Eyes' very dry sense of humor as he puts Fitz in his place. I think it's fair to say those who have read the series would agree with me that that certainly puts a grin on your face. So that is why Robin Hobb is there on this list for me. Very endearing humor and a very, I think, understated reason why we love Fitz and Night Eyes so much, as well as many of the other characters. Next for me on the list at number 7 is George R.R. Martin, and I suspect a lot of people would probably rate Martin even higher. He definitely belongs on the list for me. I'm holding up the Dunk and Egg books, which perhaps is, it has its grisly trademark George R.R. Martin gory moments, of course, but it also has some of the humor, I think, that is also a big part of Martin's success as a writer. And of course, there are characters like Tyrion Lannister, for example, who are the epitome of wit. And those moments between Tyrion and other characters where he uses his humor, his wit, to impart his insights on the other characters, I think are actually pretty brilliantly done. So there's a lot of humor in spite of the fact that we think of A Song of Ice and Fire as primarily very violent and full of conflict and all kinds of epicness. There's humor in there as well, and Martin has a really crafty sense of humor, I think, that really does make the experience of reading his world, Westeros, and the rest to be a very fulfilling one. And speaking of wit, my number 6 on the list is Scott Lynch, author of The Gentleman Bastard sequence. And I'm holding up The Lies of Locke Lamora, which is the first book in that series. 3 books completed. Hopefully there will be more, but I will never regret picking up The Lies of Locke Lamora as well as the 2 books afterwards. I love the relationship between Locke and Jean as portrayed in these books, and the witty banter that Scott Lynch is an excellent example of in these books. He's just brilliant at that. And that adds, again, to the endearing quality of these 2 characters as well as other characters in here, but also the relationship between them is something that is enhanced through that humor. And that is an aspect of this that I absolutely love. It gives, even though there are some really grim things happening in The Lies of Locke Lamora, the humor really does, I feel, create a sense of lightheartedness at times, and also brings me closer to the characters. So I absolutely love these books by Scott Lynch. Hope to see more. I know that there's going to be a novella or something like that out at some point soon, so that's great news. Next on my list, we have actually numbers 5 and 4 I grouped together. And I think that anyone who is a fan of the Malazan world would agree with me that Stephen Erickson and Ian C. Esselmont share a sense of humor. I call it Malazan humor. It can be very gallows-like humor, but it is often associated with the military fantasy aspects of their series. But it is just very, at times, dry, but it can burst out at a completely unexpected moment and make a scene, lighten a scene in a way that is just beautiful. Because there is, again, high tragedy. I think we're seeing a little bit of a trend here. You know, we have authors who have some really, really epic, tragic stuff going on. And to alleviate that, authors like Erickson and Esselmont have this skill of giving us these very human moments that suddenly break through all the tension and the tragedy. And they just make us laugh. And it is a beautiful thing. It is a wonderful thing. And they're just so wonderful at mixing in that laughter with humanity and compassion and other things that are going on in these series. At times it can lean toward, I wouldn't call it absurdist exactly, because I don't think of either author as being absurdist entirely, but it can lean that way, especially in Erickson's Bocaline and Corbel Broach novellas, where it gets really zany. This is where I feel like Erickson really lets loose with the humor, the Malazan humor, as it were, and has a good time. Makes fun of some people that I know as well in some of these novellas. So they're absolutely fantastic. Highly recommend. Of course, I love the Malazan series in general, but the humor is something that needs to be remarked upon because it is a central part of the experience. They would not be as wonderful books without that Malazan humor, for sure. So we're getting down to the top 3 here for me. And each of these 3 authors, for me, the humor is a central part of their delivery, of their essence as a writer, I believe. It's just part of who they are. I think that these authors probably cannot help being funny. It's just part of what their message is, a very human part of it, though. And I love them all. And they're slightly different in their approach to humor. Although all three in this case actually are British, so I don't know if there's a thing for me when it comes to British humor or not, but it tends to be kind of dry and often understated. But each of these to me is a genius. Each of these authors is a genius in their own way. So I'll start with number 3 here, and that is Mark Lawrence. Now, Mark Lawrence has written an array of trilogies at this point, and maybe is best known for the first one, the Broken Earth trilogy, which is grimdark. I don't think there's a ton of humor in that particular trilogy, so this might surprise some people. But if you read the sequel trilogy that is set in the same world, which is, of course, the Red Queen's War trilogy, you will find one of the most humorous characters I have ever encountered in all of literature, and that is Jalin. He is the narrator. And it's his tone that sets the tone for the Red Queen's War trilogy, which begins with Prince of Fools. He's an incredible character and unreliable narrator. And it is his unreliability that is actually, in some ways, at the heart of his humor. It is something that you have to discover for yourself. But it is something that makes him a very endearing character. And it's also, I believe, central to his relationship with Snorri. The friendship that develops in this trilogy is absolutely wonderful and endearing. It is beautiful, in fact. It's just fantastic how Mark Lawrence can take a pretty bleak world, the same world as the Broken Earth trilogy, insert a character like Jalin, and bring color and life to that world. I mean, Jalin, to me, is probably the most underrated fantasy character out there, especially in terms of humor. He should be talked about, to me, all the time. When anyone thinks of humor and fantasy, Jalin is up there for me, at the very top. And I just highly recommend, if you're somebody who's read Broken Earth Trilogy and hasn't gone on to Red Queen's War, what are you waiting for? It is such a wonderful experience. Jalin from the Red Queen's War trilogy. Next on my list will probably not surprise anyone, except that maybe it's not number 1, and at number 2, and this is probably because I haven't read a ton of this author's books yet. I will be reading more, so it is possible. I will concede it is possible that Terry Pratchett could one day be my number 1 author when it comes to the fantasy authors who make me laugh. But right now, he'll have to be content with number 2. Sir Terry, I'm sure, would be fine with that. But yes, I fully recognize Terry Pratchett's genius, having only read 4 of his books. And the first 2, really, I have to be honest with you, did not wow me in any respect whatsoever. They were okay. And those were the first 2 books in the Discworld series. So The Color of Magic and The Light, fantastic. They were fine. I got the satire. It was a nice way to pass the time. I don't think I laughed at all. I might have grinned occasionally, a little wry grin. Maybe even not that. But when I read Guards, I realized what all the hype was about. I realized why people love Terry Pratchett, for his insightfulness, his genius. In fact, I think when I made my video, this is part of a series of videos on top 10 authors who make us cry, top 10 authors who make us think, and so on and so on. I'll be making a series of these, but when I made the first one on authors who make us think, I did not include Terry Pratchett because I haven't read a ton of his books yet, but he was the most suggested author in the comments. So maybe that was an oversight on my part, not putting Pratchett in there, but I'm putting him in here at number 2, so for now. Guards was just brilliant. And so, by the way, was Equal Rights. I loved Equal Rights as well. That's the other one that I've read. And these books made me realize, okay, yes, I get it now. Pratchett is a genius. His humor is amazing. And the humor is core. It is the essence of these books. It is the vehicle through which he delivers his social critique, his story, everything else. The humor is just there. It is part of Pratchett's Discworld in a way that you can't remove it. If you remove the humor, you don't have Discworld anymore. And so that is a big, I think, endorsement for why Terry Pratchett should be near the top of everybody's fantasy authors who make you laugh list, because it is just so intrinsic. And it's brilliant, I have to say. I loved Guards, and I look forward to eventually continuing in Discworld and reading a lot more and gaining further appreciation for Sir Terry's genius. And finally, the number one on my list, probably another author that you would expect if you've read this, you probably agree with me. You would put this author somewhere on your list. And it's kind of funny because I actually regard this author's world as being one of the bleakest I have ever encountered. I actually think his vision of humanity and human experience is incredibly depressing. And yet, the genius behind his writing is in his humor, I believe, which is why Joe Abercrombie is my number one fantasy author who makes me laugh. Because it's his humor that makes these books not only bearable, but absolutely fantastic. And there's other things to say about Abercrombie. I'll be talking about other things in my other top 10 lists when I talk about action and other things. But man, the humor is just, for me, not just redeeming, but it, again, like with Terry Pratchett's books, the humor is at the core of the experience of reading the First Law books, which I cannot read without, even though I've read them now, I've read the first trilogy a couple times already, and I don't think I could read it again without laughing. I might even laugh more, having had these characters become so precious, so important to me. And it's so crazy because these people are so messed up, and yet you can't help but love them and laugh with them. And it's their awkwardness. I mean, nobody writes awkwardness, human awkwardness, like Joe Abercrombie does. It's in everything. I mean, we are kind of absurd creatures, and Joe Abercrombie really brings that out in his writing. He shows just how absurd we are, how awkward, ridiculous, hopeless, and the whole time it should be so utterly depressing. And I'm laughing. And I just can't. It's so wonderful to read I mean, they're actually in that way somehow through all that misery and depression and awkwardness and revulsion. Somehow it's uplifting to read the First Law books. It's just, I don't get it. But that's part of Joe Abercrombie's genius to me. And so, yes, that's why he is my number one fantasy author who makes me laugh. And so, yes, there's my list, and I hope to get some great recommendations. Once again, I'm very happy to hear if your authors are not fantasy authors. There are lots of authors out there who make us laugh. But I love to hear about fantasy authors who make you laugh that I missed out on here. Perhaps I haven't read them yet, and I would love to hear your recommendations. So that is it from me for now. Until next time.